Hi, it's time for another verb of the day. Today's verb is boil. Let's look at a few definitions. The first way this verb boil is used is to mean to reach the temperature at which it bubbles and turns to vapor. So for this specific definition, we're talking about liquid. So the temperature at which liquid begins to bubble and then turn to steam or vapor. A second meaning for the word or verb boil is in reference to food. If we're talking about food, it could mean to cook by immersing or putting something into boiling water or other liquid like stock. A third meaning for the verb boil is in reference to the sea or clouds, and it means that something is becoming turbulent or stormy. You're probably not going to hear or see this third definition used all that much. I think when I've seen it, it's when I've been reading literature and someone is trying to be very descriptive as they're talking about the weather or environment in which a character is in. The verb boil is regular. So to make the progressive form, all we need to do is add ing to make boiling. The past tense form of the verb is formed by adding ed. And because this verb ends in an L sound, that's a voiced sound, the ed is going to make a D sound. Boiled. Boiled. Next, let's take a look at some phrasal verbs which change the meaning of the verb boil just a little bit. The first phrasal verb we're going to look at is boil down, and it can have two very different meanings, so we'll take them one at a time. The first meaning for boil down is to heat something to reduce its volume. So another way to think of volume, the size, the quantity of something. So let's look at our example sentence, and that might help us understand the meaning. The sentence says, boil down the sauce for 20 minutes. So sometimes as you're cooking, you might start off with liquid, right? Something that's very runny, very thin is another way to describe it. And the longer you cook it, it becomes thicker. Or another way, we might say it reduces, and that connects to our phrasal verb, boil down. Another meaning for boil down is to simplify or shorten. So here's an example of that. Can you boil down the report to a single page? So taking something that might be quite long and trying to simplify it. What are the main ideas, the main points, the important takeaways? Another phrasal verb that you might hear is boil over. And this can also have two very different meanings. The first is related to cooking, and that meaning is to overflow while boiling. So imagine you have a pot of water on the stove, and it's very close to the top. You filled the pot very full. As the water starts to boil, some of it might come over the edges of the pot. That's overflowing. So here's boil over in an example sentence. I forgot about the pot on the stove and it boiled over. Boil over's second meaning, though, could be to lose one's temper and become angry. Here it is in a sentence. She boiled over with anger. The last phrasal verb we're going to look at today is boil up, and it means to grow to a dangerous level. And this is actually a phrasal verb I have heard in news reports and seen in newspaper articles over the last few weeks. So I'm borrowing a sentence from one of those articles. Grief and rage boiled up after the death of George Floyd. So again, that idea of grief and rage rising to a dangerous level. Let's continue practicing this verb boil. Today, we're going to look at making sentences in the imperative, simple present, and present progressive. You might remember with imperative, these are commands. They're very unique sentences in English because it's not a stated subject. It is implied. It's either you singular or you plural. And it's really common to see imperative sentences in recipes. So providing us the directions on how to cook something, what to do or what not to do. So to begin an affirmative sentence in the imperative, I'm just going to use the base verb, which in this case is boil. Let's look at our example. Boil the jam for 40 to 50 minutes. Again, that could be a line right out of a recipe. Here is a negative sentence. To do that, all we're going to use is do not, and then the base verb. And that's going to give us a negative command or a negative imperative. Don't boil the stock. Just let it simmer. So simmer is another verb connected to cooking. So we're cooking something at a lower temperature than boiling. There is no question form of imperatives. Those are always statements. So obviously we're not going to have an example of that. So let's move to the simple present. We use the simple present to talk about facts, habits, or routines. And in the affirmative, if our subject is I, you, we, or they, our verb is just going to be the base verb. If the subject is he, she, or it, we need to add an S to our verb. So let's take a look at an affirmative example. He boils water each morning to make tea. If my subject had been two people, so they, right, I would take that S off the verb, and then the sentence could be the exact same after that. If I want to make a negative sentence in the simple present, I'm going to use does not and then the base verb if my subject is he, she, or it. Or I'm going to use do not and the base verb if my subject is I, you, we, or they. Here's a negative example. The mixture doesn't boil quickly. So mixture here would be one thing, and that's why we're using the does not form of the negative here. If I want to make a yes or no question in the simple present, I'm going to start with do or does, then the subject, and then the base verb. Here's an example of that. Do those statements boil your blood? And I included this as an example because that might be a new phrase for you, but boil your blood is essentially make you angry. Just another way to say that. Next, let's look at present progressive. We use this verb tense to talk about an activity that is in progress or something that is happening right now. To make this verb tense, we need two parts. We're going to have our present form of be, so that's am, is, or are, and then the ing form of the verb. Let's look at an affirmative sentence. They're boiling down sap to make maple syrup. So again, this is goes back to the meaning of reducing something. So the process of making maple syrup, it's liquid that comes from trees, and it has to be cooked for a very long time. And you start off with a lot of it, and it eventually thickens but the quantity is reduced from what you started with. If we want to make a negative sentence in the present progressive, I'm going to insert not after my be verb. Here's an example of that. I'm not boiling the potatoes. And finally, if I want to make a yes or no question in the present progressive, I'm going to start with be, then our subject, then the ing form of the verb. Is the water boiling? So I'm asking sort of right now, in this moment, is that happening? Let's look at some words that are related to our verb boil. And the first related word is the exact same spelling, exact same pronunciation. It's the noun form of this word. And this noun form can have a couple different meanings, sort of just like our verb that had a few different meanings. The first meaning for the noun is the temperature at which a liquid bubbles and turns to vapor. So again, that idea of water being at a very high temperature, you can see bubbles forming and maybe some steam coming off the container that's on a stove. So here's an example. Bring the chicken stock to a boil. So one way I can tell that's a noun in that sentence is the word is coming after the article a. So it's always a helpful trick if you're a little uncertain. A second meaning for the word boil is a casual outdoor meal at which shellfish is prepared by boiling. Now, I live here in Iowa, and so we're not near big oceans or other bodies of water where it's very common for shellfish to be in our diet. So this noun form is something you might hear more closely if you live in a coastal area. So when I think of this word, I think of the Northeast, like Massachusetts and Maine, but I also think of Louisiana, down in our southern coast as well. So let me give you an example of this. The crawfish boil will be held in the park from 5 to 7 p.m. So again, the word boil here is a noun. It's an event, an outdoor meal, and the particular type of shellfish, this example, is crawfish. In other parts of the country, you might hear them called crawdads. I think same creature. The next word we're going to look at is boiler. It's a noun. It's a fuel-burning apparatus or container for heating water. When I think of this particular word, I think of really large facilities and buildings. You might be thinking of, a water heater that's in your house. These two things are a little different. A boiler, I believe, is going to kind of rapidly produce hot water almost instantaneously, where a water heater has kind of this larger component of like sitting and waiting and refilling. And I'm not an expert in water heaters or boilers, but they aren't quite the same thing, but they end up producing something very similar, which is hot water. Here's an example of boiler in a sentence. The repair person said it would take 2 weeks to replace the boiler. The last related word we're going to look at today is an adjective, boiled. And it can have a couple different meanings. The first is to describe food that's cooked in boiling water or stock. Here's an example of that. She ate boiled eggs for breakfast. Another meaning for boiled is really liquid that's been heated to reach a boiling point. So here's an example of that. You should only consume boiled water. And that last statement actually connects to something that might occasionally happen. Pipes might break, and it might not be safe for us to go to the sink in our kitchen and get a glass of water. The treatment might have been interfered with or disrupted when there's damage to pipes in our neighborhood. So you might hear of a city or a certain neighborhood having a boil order. And that's what they're telling you to do, is boil all the water to make sure all the impurities kind of go away before you consume it. Thanks so much for watching today's video. I hope you have a wonderful day.